A great Roman poet once said, "Adversity reveals the genius of a man. Good fortune conceals it." The greatest lessons of management and leadership are learned not when things are easy, but when the economy is uncertain, the competition is circling like vultures, and the way forward is unclear. It is in hard times that great leaders demonstrate just how well they understand their business and show how valuable their products are to their customers. Here today to talk about this kind of exceptional leadership is Harish Manwani, Global Executive Advisor at Blackstone. In 2008, Harish was presented with CNBC's Asia Business Leader of the Year award. His 2014 TED Talk on profits, not only the point, has been viewed by over 1.4 million people. His views on leadership, that leaders need to be visionary and set the tone for employees, has seen him lead from the front as the Chief Operating Officer of Unilever, where he was recently retired from after 38 years of service to the company. He is currently a global executive advisor to Blackstone Private Equity Group and is on the board of companies like Whirlpool, Pearson, and Qualcomm. He also serves on the board of the Indian School of Business and the Economic Development Board of Singapore. He is an innovator, thinker, and global speaker. We are very lucky to have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Harish Manwani.
Good morning, good afternoon. I know for some of you this must be probably good evening or good night, but I must say it's been an exciting morning, and my job really remains one of kind of summarizing what I've heard everyone say. Because all the things that I wanted to say have actually been said, which is no bad thing, because at the end of the day, we are all running businesses, and the lessons are fairly common. Having said that, I must start by making a small confession. I'm amidst people who are technology folks, academics, and many others, and I've spent my entire life really selling soap and soup. So the question is, what is a guy who sold soap and soup all his life going to talk about changing the world, talk about leadership, talk about disruption, and talk about managing in turbulent times? Well, I'm going to give it a go. The only thing I would say is that a lot of what I will say will be colored by the 37 and a half years that I spent in Unilever, where I am absolutely proud to say that I never once felt that all I do is sell soap and soup. I think the fact that we sell soap and soup in 180 countries, and we do a great business, and we make sure that we change people's lives is what kept me going. So that I think Flo talked about a purpose. So there are many, many common lessons, whether you run a technology company or you run a consumer goods company. The only thing I will say is doing business is a good thing, and we mustn't feel embarrassed about it. And doing good business is even better. So when someone asks me, how can Unilever change the world, I always say, our biggest multiplier is the fact that we have 2 billion people who use our brands every day. We are a $60-odd billion company. We have 2 billion people. It's not the turnover that matters. We've got 2 billion people who use our products every day. By the way, 1.4 billion people get onto Facebook. So we're still a little ahead. Our power to have small actions can make a big difference to the world. So pause and hold that thought. Anyway, let me just talk a little bit about managing business in turbulent times, and I'm going to talk about managing businesses. You've talked throughout the morning about innovation. I will refrain from specifically making this entire session about innovation, okay? Because I think we mustn't also become what I call innovation junkies, and more about that too. So let me first talk about the context in which we manage businesses today. talk about a few trends, none of which is new. You've heard this right through the morning. And then I will basically share with you my own learnings on how do you manage businesses in today's context and how do you kind of lead businesses in today's context. So the first thing, of course, is, and I think everyone said it, we live in a VUCA world. A world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I don't need to elaborate that. Several examples were given. Who would have predicted that the price of oil would go from 110 to $35 a barrel? Who would have predicted that Al-Qaeda may not be there, but we have a new terrorist group in ISIS? Who would have predicted, for example, that there is a possibility of a Brexit? And importantly, who can predict whether it could be a Trump presidency in the United States? So these are all things that none of us can actually predict. And if anything, as VK quite rightly said, we live in a world where the new normal is not just change, but the rate of change. It's exponential. And Moore's law applies not just to technology and computing power, it applies to every single element of change that you see around you. It's exponential. And I think in a world like this, you've got to ask yourself, so what does it mean for us? And it only means one thing. In the past, we would predict the future on the basis of the trends we saw. Sorry, we can't do that. In the past, we always said, change that is going to happen to you is happening somewhere else in the world. And if you can pick that up early as a trend, you know it's going to happen everywhere else. Sorry, you can't do that either. So the only way, as a wise person once said, to really predict the future is to create it. And that's what you've been discussing. How do you kind of create the future for your companies? Whether it's innovation or a few other things that I will talk about. But you know, behind all this VUCA world, there are some very, very important mega trends. And I'm going to pick three, none of which are new. Two of them have been referred to by almost every single speaker, and one of them I want to spend a few more moments. The first, of course, is the trend on digitization. We live in a world where there are more mobile phones than there are people. More than 45% of the world is now connected with the possibilities of a one-on-one connect. This is amazing. And since all of us have thrown statistics right through the morning on what technology is doing, let me just add one of my own, because that's the only one that wasn't used, which is that in 48 hours, the amount of information received and generated is more than the entire amount of information received and generated between the start of civilization and 2003. Think about it. In 48 hours, we are actually literally turning around as much stuff as the entire mankind did from the start. That's amazing. And I think the question then is that in a situation like this, and if I take my business, the business I worked for, everything has changed. What people watch, where they watch, what people buy, where they buy, has fundamentally changed. And the takeout for the business, therefore, is very simple. This may not sound very profound, but believe me, is perhaps the best assumption you can make, that your business will be disrupted no matter what. Simple. No matter what business you're in, it's going to be disrupted. So the question is, you have to address scenarios of what could possibly happen. The second, and again this was referred to, the role of aggregators and intermediaries is going to diminish. If you cannot add value directly for consumers and customers, you have no role to play. And the third, which I think is very exciting, is this whole democratization of entrepreneurship. The world is going to see a bottom-up wave of value creators, not just a top-down set of Fortune 500 companies. IBS is one of them. And I'm proud to say that I've had the opportunity to be associated with them, and that's one of them. There are going to be thousands of flowers blooming who are going to create value. This is an asset-light model where intellectual capital will trump economic capital. If you don't own intellectual capital in this world, you're going to be out of business, I believe, no matter whether you make oil, gas, soap, or soup. So to my mind, that's the implication of digitization. The second big trend, of course, is the emergence of the emerging world and urbanization. Again, this was alluded to. But I think we don't quite recognize what is going on. 57% of the world's GDP in PPP terms comes from the developing markets. 85% of the world lives in the developing markets. And by the way, developing markets may not be flavor of the month in the last 1 year or so. Fact of the matter is that most of the world's growth is still contributed by emerging markets. And the difference is that the model of global growth was all about the developing market producing and the developed markets consuming. And that's fundamentally changing. As the consumption begins to now power the growth in the developing markets. So the big change is this model of one part producing and the other part consuming to now 85% of the people becoming a consumer powerhouse. By 2020, Asia alone will consume more than all of the United States and Europe put together. Now, so what's the takeout for the business? Takeout for the business is very simple. Follow the people. Don't just follow the money where it is today. Follow the people. Where there are people, there are consumers. Shashi Tharoor also referred to that. Where there are people, there are consumers. And the last bit on geographies is urbanization. 600 cities, as McKinsey says, are going to contribute to 60% of the world's GDP. I think this is a very big deal for businesses. And the ability for technology to change people's lives and all the other challenges that come with it are things that we need to focus on as a business. And that brings me to the third big trend, which is sustainability and inclusiveness. This hasn't been talked about. It's really important. We are consuming the resources of 1.5 planets. And I think all of you smart folks here know that we don't have 1.5 planets. And if the developing world begins to consume like the developed world, we will need anywhere between 3 to 5 planets. So in other words, we are now living in a resource-scarce world where a couple of billion people don't have access to sanitation, hygiene, the quality of air is bad, the quality of water is not good enough. And in a world like this, the question we've got to ask ourselves is, what's the role of business? Are you going to be part of the problem, or do you want to be part of the solution? And I do believe that business has no other option but to be part of the solution. I think VK said it correctly. We must make sure that the standard of living and consumption must continue, because the world needs growth and companies need growth. So reducing growth and consumption is not the answer. But the question is, can you create a model of responsible consumption and the ability to be able to power up output without having to use the same resources? So you talked about innovation. To my mind, this is the biggest area of innovation for the future. The second bit is about inclusiveness. Now you can say, we all firmly believe in the capitalist philosophy of creating wealth and value creation. Of course. But we now live in a world where 80 people have more wealth than the entire 50% of the world's population at the bottom. So 80 people have more wealth than 3.5 billion people in the world. Every television program tells you that in the United States, the income of the middle class America has not gone up since the 70s, real income. All I can say is that business has to be part of that solution. We have to make sure that we create wealth. We also have to make sure that we create models where we can have inclusive growth and sustainable growth. And I just want us to keep that at the back of our mind. So having talked about the VUCA world, the three big trends, digitization, emerging world, and urbanization, and of course sustainability, how do we kind of manage in a world like this? And I think my starting point, again, I want to reiterate, is this is all about growth, growth, and growth. Make no mistake, as soon as we compromise on growth, we lose the game. So the question is, how do we manage for growth in a VUCA world? And I'm going to just share with you some really practical things that I have learned through my experience of managing businesses for some years in different parts of the world. I was fortunate enough to have worked for Unilever in almost every part of the world, from North America to Latin America to Asia to Europe. And of course, that kind of gives you a little bit of perspective. So here goes. The first important learning I've had is, if you want to grow businesses in a volatile world or any kind of turbulent environment, have a clear definition of success. Clear definition of success. What does success mean? No person in the organization must be confused about what is winning. And by the way, winning only takes place in one place. It happens in the marketplace with consumers and customers. It doesn't take place within the organization. Just to give you an example, when I used to travel around to various countries, I had one metric, which was relevant for us. I'm saying you can decide your own. And I used to call it the 3M metrics. And people called it the 4M because they added Manwani, my name, after it. And the 3M was, before you show me anything, just show me what your market share is, what your margins are, and what the mood of the business is. That's all I want to know first. Market share, how are you performing vis-a-vis market? Not how are you performing, are you growing 5%, 10%, irrelevant for me. How are you performing in relation to the market? Number two, are you growing your margins? Because that's important. Keeping focus on margins is critical for the long-term survival of the business. And third, are you engaging your people? What's the mood of the business? Market share, margin, mood. And if you can't show me that on your first slide, I'm sorry, I'm not interested in the rest of the presentation. Now that was what I defined success in the role that I was doing. The second bit, and this is a little provocative, but I'm trying to be a bit binary, I think the medium term is dead. As a time horizon, medium term has played out and is not as relevant. Why do I say that? Because I do believe that the long term and the short term is absolutely mission critical. The long term is critical because in turbulent times, a clarity in terms of destination is even more important than ever. It's like going in a ship in a storm. You need to know where you're going from A to B. And clarity, and you talked about flow, you talked about purpose. What's your destination? Why are we here? What are we trying to do? Absolutely clear. That's the long term. And then you got to make sure that you understand how you're going to deliver the short term. So the game is between the long term and the short term. And I'll make it even quite simple. You can create your long term. You have to deal with your short term, but you can never predict the medium term. So don't try. The only thing that matters is scenarios. So anyone who's trying to, and now you may say, what's medium term, what's short term? It depends on the horizon of your businesses. So I think that's the second big learning that I've had. Focus on a destination, focus on the here and now. The third is make choices. I know this is motherhoods, but at the end of the day, we all live with limited resources. You have to make choices. You cannot do everything. And going deep rather than going wide, according to my experience, is far better than trying to go wide before you go deep. So focus, make choices, don't ignore the core of your business. But the critical thing is, you have to decide. You can't do everything. The fourth thing, and again, since we've been talking innovation throughout the morning, execution is strategy. And strategy is execution. My definition of execution is very simple. It's the ability of the organization to convert plans into a P&L. Simple. If you cannot convert your plans into a P&L, what the hell are we doing? Everyone can give you great plans. I can put a strategy together. If I can't, I'll hire McKinsey to do it. But the question is, do you have the executional capacity and the capability in the organization? And again, this is not to say that this is the most important thing. But I have found time and again that this plays the critical role in terms of a good performance and a great performance. The next bit is business unusual on costs. Very important. When I was growing up in the organization, we used to have a person, he was an iconic person, wise factory manager running our largest soap factory. And he called me once and said, "You still have a long career in front of you. And I'm going to give you a piece of advice. The only thing that matters in organizations are people who sell soap and who make soap. Everyone else is an overhead." Okay? Now, this was a man saying it the way it is. I'm not saying no one else matters, but the point is, often as we grow, we forget which part of the organization adds value and which doesn't. Even today, I use this formula, what I call, his name was Mr. A.C. Chakravarti, so I called him A.C. Da, which is, elder brother. And I use what I call the A.C. Da formula. Whether it's the United States or Brazil or Indonesia, I always ask them to show me where are the costs, where are the people, how many of them are front-facing, how many of them are producing things, how many of them are selling things, and the rest of them, you better give a great explanation why they are there. And I think it's important. Business unusual on costs. Always assume the worst, plan for the worst, and hope for the best. My next learning is follow consumers and not competitors. Often, in the adrenaline of the day-to-day business, we begin to follow our competitors. You cannot drive cars by looking into the rear-view mirror. You got to look ahead. Follow your customers. Follow your consumers. Some of you who run a B2B business, it's about customers. We run I was part of a B2C business. There are millions of consumers. If I visit a market, I cannot possibly start any meeting unless I've spent a whole day visiting consumer homes and visiting stores. Because that's our business. Whether it happens to be in the dusty roads of rural India, or it happens to be in Walmarts or Tesco's of US or Europe. You've got to do that and follow your consumers. And I can't think of a better way, a better segue into innovation. And the next point is innovation. And I think all of you have picked on this. And I think the most important thing, frankly, is a definition of innovation within the organization. Because otherwise, you will have a tendency of creating confusion amongst people. Coincidentally, last week, I was in Singapore and I'm part of this Committee for the Future Economy. And they had invited InnoSight, which is an organization founded by Clayton Christensen, the guru of innovation. And in this presentation, it started off by exactly this. First, define innovation. And the way they suggested you define innovation is something different that creates value. So it's not about inventing products alone. It's about products and processes, but creating value. I think Rajiv referred to this. How do you make sure that everyone in the organization understands what you mean when you say innovation? Something different that creates value. In my words, innovation in an organization or a culture of innovation must not be owned by a bunch of folks who work in innovation centers. Innovation has to be owned by the poets of the organization and the farmers of the organization. People who create and people who do, because both create value. Having said that, the question really is, how do you create that culture? This culture of sort of the alchemy of blending what I call magic and logic. How do you combine magic and logic? Because both are important. And this culture really, and again I think you alluded to it, comes from the very top. The tone is set from the top, which is that you value people who find solutions for consumers and customers. Whether they happen to be working at level A, level B, it doesn't really matter, or which function. So the culture of innovation, and I would urge you to ask yourself whether in your organization you have that combination of magic and logic. Are there people who can think on these blank sheets of paper, but are there people who can translate it into real value? My big learning again on innovation is bigger, fewer, bolder. In other words, you have limited resources. You can try doing everything. I know it sounds great to have workshops and so on. That's all good stuff to generate ideas. Commit yourself to fewer, bigger, bolder innovation. Recognize that innovation is not a one-year agenda. It will take more resources than you've always planned. So the number one thing is take fewer innovations, commit yourself to it. And the second bit on innovation is start small, scale fast. We often try to perfect that innovation within our establishments. Start small, scale fast. If it works 80%, be ready to get out there, because the last 20% is going to be determined in the marketplace. And my last point is on organization. Keep the organization simple and agile. As you become bigger, there is a tendency to create organizations that are complex, where instead of talking to your consumers and customers, you begin to talk to each other. Okay? And that's the worst thing that can happen in organizations. You talk to each other. One silo talks to another one before you can even decide. And the world is moving there at a speed of knots. VUCA, everything happening around you. So, how to do that? And just when in doubt, always think of what Mark Twain said. Don't let school come in the way of education. Don't let organizations come in the way of serving your consumers and customers. Don't seek permission to do things that are right. Go out there. Don't check out, is it my responsibility, someone else's. So on organizations, keep it simple, keep it agile. And one last thing I want to talk about, and again this was referred to, how do you create a future-ready talent that has the license to operate in a digital, global, and VUCA world? We often forget that inspiration is good, but creating organizational capabilities are critical in this new world, where the world is changing. And I'm sure a lot of you have read this book, Corporate Athlete, by Jim Loehr. And he talks about the fact that when athletes athletes spend 85% of their time training and 15% of their time performing. In corporates, every executive, every employee spends 85% of their time performing and 15% of the time training. Ask yourself, how are you balancing performance and inputs? So output, input. Are your employees outputting all the time, or are you giving them a chance to input? Now, what we've spoken about are, at the end of the day, what I call the hardware. This is the hardware of managing businesses. But at the heart of everything, of course, is the software, which is leadership. And what is the biggest challenge that we face in the world today as businesses, as leaders of businesses? I think the biggest challenge we face is a trust deficit. The people do not trust leaders anymore, whether they are political leaders or corporate leaders, because they believe that they are not out there to be part of that solution to society's problems. They're out there for themselves. And I think we have to recognize this. The role of leaders in today's context is really twofold: managing and building the reputation of organizations, and the second is to give energy to the organization. One is an external role, one is an internal role. That's the role of leadership in turbulent times. How do you make sure that you are the custodian of the reputation of this organization? And number two, how do you make sure that you unleash energy? Because the difference in performance between companies A and company B, good and great companies, is not the people, is not the talent. It's the energy in people. And that energy is given by leaders. When you walk into the room, do you suck energy or you give energy? And I think that, to my mind, is what differentiates it. So if we are going to talk about the new role of leadership, you've got to talk about the role of business. And I want to talk about now, since I talked about 3 M's, I'm going to talk about 4 G's. The traditional model has been always what I call the 3G model of growth. We always talk about growth that is consistent, quarter on quarter, growth that is competitive, better than the marketplace, and growth that is profitable. continuous improvement in margins. That's the 3G model all of us were brought up in, quarter on quarter, consistent, competitive, profitable growth. And we need to add a fourth G to it, growth that is responsible. In your business, you got to ask, are you actually making sure that you have a fourth G, that whatever you are doing, you are making sure that the growth that you get is also responsible growth. And that requires one thing, actually two things, a definition of purpose. When, William Haskett Lever founded Unilever 150, 160 years ago, he introduced the first branded bar of soap in Victorian England. And you read his mission statement, it was not about a bar of soap. It was actually protecting lives, because the biggest killer in those days was actually lack of sanitation and hygiene. Even today, we run the largest hand washing program in the world with our brand called Lifebuoy, because we believe it saves more lives than any pharmaceutical company if you can convince people to wash their hands. Now, this is just one example, but the reason why people get up in the morning, like I said, is not because they want to sell soap and soup, because there is a larger purpose. And the second is a clarity on non-negotiables. No matter which part of the world you are in, Nigeria, Brazil, UK, Dubai, there has to be one set of non-negotiables, things that you won't do. In other words, leaders will create organizations that are purpose-driven and values-led. That's the role of leadership in turbulent times, purpose-driven and values-led. And values is the glue that holds organizations together, particularly organizations that are dispersed, because you cannot be talking to people all the time, but you have to embed them with a common set of values and a common purpose. And I want to therefore end with really something where I want to paraphrase Jim Collins. Jim Collins has spoken about good to great. I'm going to talk about great to good. Today's businesses and the businesses of tomorrow are going to businesses that will go from being great to good. Great for creating shareholder value and good for the societies that you serve. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. I now request Phil Hinton, our Senior Vice President, to come and give us a...
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.